It started like any ordinary afternoon. Quiet, unremarkable, the kind of moment no one would ever expect to turn into something unforgettable. Chuck Norris' daughter was out on her own, dressed simply, blending into the crowd like any other young woman. No bodyguards, no spotlight, just a normal day, running a quick errand in a public place where people passed by without a second glance. She had grown up with discipline and humility, taught to respect others and avoid trouble whenever possible. Her father had made sure of that. Fame was never something she leaned on. In fact, most people had no idea who she was or who her father was. And that's exactly why what happened next caught her completely off guard. A small group nearby noticed her. At first, it was just whispers and laughter, the kind that makes you uneasy but unsure whether it's really about you. She ignored it and kept walking, hoping it would end there. But it didn't. One of them stepped closer, blocking her path just enough to make his presence known. Another laughed louder. A third joined in, turning curiosity into confidence. They made assumptions about who she was, about how much power she had, about how far they could go without consequences. She tried to stay calm. She shifted her bag on her shoulder and attempted to step around them. That's when the tone changed. The jokes turned sharper. The space around her felt smaller. A few people nearby noticed something was wrong, but no one moved. No one spoke up. The silence from the crowd made the moment feel heavier. Her heart raced, but she didn't panic. She stood her ground, eyes steady, voice controlled. She had been taught never to escalate, never to react with fear. Still, the bullies mistook her calm for weakness. To them, this was entertainment, control, power. What they didn't realize was that this calm wasn't helplessness. It was confidence. The kind that comes from knowing who you are, from knowing where you come from. As one of them leaned in a little closer, smirking, the air shifted. Something about the moment felt wrong, like a line was about to be crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. Somewhere far from their thoughts was a name they hadn't even considered. A man known worldwide not just for strength, but for discipline, honor, and consequences. And in just a few moments, they were going to understand exactly whose daughter they were dealing with. At first, it still felt like something that could be brushed off. Chuck Norris' daughter took a slow breath and tried to keep moving, hoping the situation would fade the way awkward moments sometimes do. But the bullies weren't interested in letting it go. One of them laughed again, louder this time, drawing attention. Another stepped closer, just enough to invade her personal space. "Hey, we're talking to you," one of them said, his tone mocking, confident that he had the upper hand. She stopped walking, not because she was afraid, but because she knew ignoring them any longer might make things worse. Calmly, she said, "I don't want any trouble. Please step aside." Her voice was steady, respectful, but firm. That firmness surprised them. For a brief second, they hesitated. Then one of them smirked. "Listen to her," he said to the others, shaking his head. "She thinks she's important." Laughter followed, the kind that feeds on itself, the kind that grows when no one steps in to stop it. People nearby had definitely noticed now. A man slowed his pace, pretending to check his phone. A couple standing a few steps away exchanged uncomfortable glances. Everyone could feel the tension, but no one wanted to be the one to get involved. It was easier to look away, easier to pretend nothing serious was happening. The bullies took that silence as permission. One of them moved in front of her again, blocking her path more clearly this time. Another circled slightly to the side. It wasn't violent, but it was deliberate, intimidating, a test to see how far they could push. She tightened her grip on her bag, but didn't raise her voice. "Please," she said again, "just let me pass." That's when one of them scoffed. Or what? The question hung in the air. For the first time, her heart beat a little faster, not from fear, but from anger. Not explosive anger, controlled anger, the kind that reminds you of your boundaries, of what you will and won't accept. She looked him straight in the eye. "Or you'll regret making this bigger than it needs to be." The bullies burst out laughing. "To hear that from you," one of them said. "That's rich." To them, she was alone. No protection, no authority, no consequences. They didn't see discipline. They didn't see confidence. They saw a target they thought wouldn't fight back. What they didn't understand was that calm isn't weakness. Sometimes it's restraint. A few people in the crowd had started quietly recording. Not openly, just phones angled slightly, screens glowing. There was a feeling now that something important was happening. Something that might not end the way the bullies expected. One of the bullies leaned in closer and said something under his breath, quiet enough that others couldn't hear, but close enough that it crossed a line. Her expression changed. Not to fear, not to panic, to resolve. She took a small step back, creating space. Then she reached in her pocket. The bullies noticed immediately. "Oh, what's that?" one of them mocked. "You calling someone?" She didn't answer right away. She simply unlocked her phone. That silence made them uncomfortable. For the first time, doubt flickered across one of their faces. Not much, but enough. Still, pride pushed them forward. "Go ahead," another said. "Call whoever you want." She looked up at them, calm as ever. "I hope you're ready for the consequences," she said quietly. They laughed again, but this time it wasn't as confident. Somewhere nearby, someone whispered, "This is getting out of hand." And that's where we pause for a moment, because I want to ask you something. Have you ever witnessed bullying like this in public? Tell us which country or city you're watching from in the comments below. Because what happens next proves that sometimes the biggest mistakes people make are the ones where they assume no one powerful is watching. And these bullies were about to realize just how wrong they were. The air felt different now. Heavier. Quieter in a way that made every sound sharper. The distant traffic, the hum of voices nearby, the faint buzz from a phone recording somewhere in the crowd. Chuck Norris' daughter stood there with her phone in her hand, not dialing yet, not rushing, just holding it, waiting. The bullies noticed. For the first time since this started, they weren't completely sure who was in control anymore. One of them cleared his throat and tried to laugh it off. "What? You calling your friends now?" he said, but the joke didn't land the way he expected. His voice cracked just enough to give him away. She met his eyes. Calm, unshaken. "I gave you a chance to walk away," she said. "All of you." That sentence did something strange to the moment. It wasn't loud. It wasn't threatening, but it carried weight. The kind that doesn't come from arrogance, only certainty. Another bully stepped forward, trying to reassert dominance. "You don't get to warn us," he said. "You're the one in our way." That was the mistake. She slowly slipped her phone back in her pocket, not making the call yet. Instead, she straightened her posture and took a small step forward. Not aggressively, confidently. Enough to make them instinctively lean back without even realizing it. "I'm not afraid of you," she said evenly. "But I won't let you disrespect me either." The crowd was fully locked in now. People had stopped pretending not to notice. A man across the way shook his head quietly. A woman nearby whispered, someone should step in. Phones were openly raised. This was no longer invisible. The bullies felt it too. Eyes on them. Pressure building. One of them scoffed again, but it sounded forced. "You think you're special or something?" She paused before answering. "No," she said. "I think actions have consequences." That word, consequences, hung in the air longer than anything else she'd said. The leader of the group leaned closer, invading her space again. "And who's going to make us regret it?" he asked, lowering his voice. "You?" She didn't move back. She didn't raise her hands. She didn't shout. She simply said one sentence. "My father taught me to stay calm, even when people underestimate who they're dealing with." That was it. Not a name, not a threat, just a statement. The bullies laughed, but it wasn't the same laughter anymore. It came too quickly, too loudly, like they were trying to convince themselves everything was still under control. One of them glanced over his shoulder at the crowd. Another shifted his weight nervously. They could feel it slipping. Someone in the crowd murmured, "Did you hear that?" Another voice whispered, "Who's her father?" The bullies didn't hear those words clearly, but they felt the change. The attention, the doubt, the sudden realization that maybe, just maybe, they hadn't thought this through. One of them waved his hand dismissively. "Everyone's got a tough dad," he said. "That doesn't scare us." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once. "All right," she said. "That's your choice." She reached for her phone again. This time, there was no hesitation. The moment stretched. Seconds passed. No one spoke. The bullies waited for something, anything to happen, to confirm they were still in control. But instead, something far more unsettling occurred. From the edge of the crowd, a figure had stopped walking. Tall, calm, unhurried. He hadn't rushed in. He hadn't shouted. He was simply standing there now, watching the situation with quiet intensity. His posture was relaxed, but there was an unmistakable authority about him, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. One of the bullies noticed him first. "Hey, who's that?" he muttered. Another glanced over and frowned. "Why is he staring like that?" Chuck Norris' daughter hadn't turned around yet. She didn't need to. Somehow she knew. She slowly lowered her phone and took a breath. "And right here, before anything else happens, I want to ask you something. If you were in her place right now, what would you do? Would you walk away or stand your ground? Comment your answer below, because in the next moment, everything changes." The bullies thought they were about to face an argument. What they were actually about to face was the consequence they never saw coming. At first, no one noticed him. He didn't arrive with noise or urgency. There was no shouting, no sudden movement that screamed for attention. He simply stepped closer from the edge of the crowd, his pace unhurried, his presence quiet but unmistakable, the kind of presence that makes people straighten their posture without knowing why. Chuck Norris' daughter finally turned around. The moment her eyes met his, something in her expression softened, not into relief, but into reassurance. She nodded once, small, respectful, as if to say, "I handled it as long as I could." The bullies followed her gaze. They saw a man dressed simply. No flashy clothes. No aggressive stance. Just calm confidence. Hands relaxed at his sides. Eyes steady, observing everything without saying a word. One of the bullies scoffed. "What's this?" he muttered. "Back up." The man stopped a few steps away. He didn't crowd them. He didn't raise his voice. When he finally spoke, it was low and even almost polite. "Is there a problem here?" The question landed harder than any insult. For a moment, no one answered. The bullies exchanged glances, trying to read the situation. They were used to fear, anger, resistance. This was different. This was control. One of them laughed nervously. "No, man, just talking." The man tilted his head slightly, eyes never leaving them. "It doesn't look like just talking." That was all. No threats, no accusations, just an observation. Something about the way he spoke made the space feel smaller. Not because he was intimidating, but because he was certain of himself, certain of where he stood. The leader of the group puffed out his chest. "Who are you?" he asked, trying to reclaim dominance. The man glanced briefly at his daughter, then back at them. "Someone who expects respect," he said calmly, "especially toward her." That sentence shifted everything. The crowd leaned in. Phones rose higher. Whispers rippled through the air. "Is that her dad? He doesn't look scared at all. Why do I recognize him?" The bullies felt it too. That subtle change in energy when a situation starts slipping out of your control. One of them took a step back without realizing it. Another crossed his arms, defensive now instead of confident. Still, pride pushed them forward. "She should mind her own business," one said. "We didn't do anything." The man didn't react immediately. He let the words sit there. Then he nodded once. "All right," he said. "Then this is simple." He took a step closer, not invading their space, but close enough that they could no longer ignore him. "You apologize," he continued calmly, "and you walk away." The bullies blinked. "You serious?" One of them laughed. "Who do you think you are?" The man looked at him, really looked at him, and in that gaze was something that made the laughter die instantly. Not anger, not aggression, experience. "I'm someone who's trying to give you a chance to make the right decision," he said. The leader of the group swallowed. "And if we don't?" The man's voice didn't change. "Then this situation becomes something you won't enjoy." Still no violence. Still no raised voice. Yet somehow, that was more unsettling than shouting. One of the bullies whispered under his breath, "Why does he sound so confident?" Another frowned harder now, squinting at the man's face. "Wait a second." He leaned slightly to the side, trying to get a better look. The angle, the eyes, the unmistakable calm that seemed almost legendary. His face paled. "Guys," he murmured, "I think I know who that is." The leader snapped back. "You don't know anything." But the doubt had already spread. The man stood there, unmoving, patient. He wasn't in a hurry. He didn't need to be. Time was on his side. Chuck Norris' daughter remained silent behind him, her posture relaxed now. She wasn't afraid anymore. She never really had been, but now she knew the lesson was about to be complete. The crowd's whispers grew louder. That looks like Chuck Norris. No way, seriously? Why would he be here? The bullies heard it. Their confidence cracked, but they still hadn't fully realized the truth yet. And that hesitation, those few seconds of denial, were about to make what happened next even more unforgettable. Because in the next moment, the realization wouldn't come from the crowd. It would come from the man himself. The words hanging in the air felt heavier now. The bullies stood frozen, caught between denial and dawning fear. One of them kept staring at the man's face, his brow furrowed, as if his memory was desperately trying to catch up with reality. He had seen that face before, on screens, on posters, in interviews. Strong, calm, unmistakable. No, he muttered quietly, almost to himself. The leader noticed the change immediately. What? He snapped. What's wrong with you? The man didn't answer right away. His eyes never left the figure standing calmly in front of them. Then he swallowed hard. I think, he began, then stopped. His confidence collapsed mid-sentence. I think that's Chuck Norris. The name rippled through the group like a shockwave. That's not funny, the leader said quickly. You're messing around. I'm not, he whispered back. Look at him. The stance, the voice, the eyes. The others looked again, really looked this time, not as a random stranger, not as just a protective father, but as a man whose reputation was built on discipline, control, and legendary strength. Their laughter was gone now. The crowd's whispers grew louder, more certain. That is him. Chuck Norris? No way. What are the odds? Phone zoomed in. Hand shook slightly. This wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was a moment people knew they'd talk about later. Chuck Norris stood there, unmoving, giving them time to process. He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it. He simply waited, calm as stone. Finally, the leader forced a laugh, weak and hollow. So what? You're supposed to scare us now. Chuck Norris tilted his head slightly. No, he said. I'm here to end this. That answer unsettled them more than any threat could have. One of the bullies took a step back. We didn't know, he said quickly. If we'd known. Chuck raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. That's the problem, he said evenly. Respect shouldn't depend on who someone's related to. Silence. The words hit harder than anything else that had been said so far. The crowd felt it. Even the bullies felt it, because deep down, they knew he was right. He turned slightly, gesturing toward his daughter. She asked you to walk away. She stayed calm. She gave you every chance. His gaze returned to them. You chose not to. The leader's shoulders slumped. The confidence he'd built moments earlier evaporated completely. We were just messing around, he muttered. Chuck Norris shook his head slowly. That's not what it looked like. No yelling. No insults. Just truth. One of the bullies glanced around, realizing how many people were watching now. How many cameras were pointed at them. How exposed they suddenly were. The power dynamic had flipped completely, and they felt it. I'm sorry, one of them blurted out. It came out fast, panicked, desperate to undo what couldn't be undone. Chuck studied him for a moment. Then he nodded. That's a start. The leader hesitated, pride warring with fear. Finally, he exhaled sharply. All right, he said. We're sorry. The apology sounded forced, but it was there. Chuck didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply said, good. Then he stepped slightly to the side, clearing the path. Now walk away, he continued calmly. And don't make someone else feel the way you just did. The bullies didn't argue. They didn't joke. They didn't look back. They turned and left, quietly, quickly, try to escape the weight of what had just happened. As they disappeared into the distance, the crowd exhaled almost in unison. Some people clapped softly. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Chuck Norris turned to his daughter. You handled yourself well, he said quietly. She nodded. You taught me how. That exchange, simple, private, said more than any speech could. But the moment wasn't over yet. Because while the bullies were gone, the lesson hadn't fully landed. And Chuck Norris wasn't finished speaking. Not to them, but to everyone watching. In the next part, He delivers a message that turns this incident from a confrontation into something far bigger. For a brief moment after the bullies walked away, the space felt suspended in time. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if everyone present was processing what they had just witnessed. Not a fight, not an explosion of anger, but something far more powerful. Control. Chuck Norris stood quietly, watching until the bullies disappeared from sight. Only then did he turn back toward his daughter. His posture softened, his voice lowering so only she could hear. "Are you all right?" She nodded. Yes. That was enough for him. He didn't hover. He didn't make a scene. He trusted the strength he had helped build in her. But the crowd hadn't gone anywhere. People stood frozen, phones still raised, eyes locked on the man they now fully recognized. Some looked impressed. Others looked reflective. A few looked ashamed, perhaps thinking about times they hadn't spoken up when they should have. Chuck Norris took a slow breath and addressed the group, not loudly, but clearly enough that everyone could hear. "This didn't have to happen," he said. The words cut through the silence. "When people see someone they think is weaker, different, or alone," he continued, "they sometimes forget their own responsibility." He looked around, making eye contact with strangers. Not accusing, not judging, just reminding. "My daughter didn't need me to fight for her," he said. "She needed respect." That line hit deep. A man in the crowd nodded slowly. A woman lowered her phone, eyes misty. This wasn't about celebrity anymore. It was about character. Chuck went on. "Real strength isn't about intimidating others. It's about knowing you have power and choosing not to abuse it." No one interrupted him. No one even shifted their weight. Then he said something that surprised everyone. "And that goes for all of us." He gestured gently to the crowd. Not just the people who caused the problem, but the people who watched it happen. That landed harder than anything else. A few heads dropped. A few people exchanged uncomfortable glances. They understood exactly what he meant. Silence, when someone is being mistreated, is still a choice. Chuck let that thought breathe before continuing. "If you see something like this," he said, "you don't have to be aggressive. You don't have to be loud, but you do have to be present." His daughter stood beside him, calm and composed, living proof of that lesson. A few people began clapping, softly at first. Then more joined in, not the explosive applause of a show, but the respectful kind, the kind reserved for something meaningful. Chuck raised a hand slightly, signaling for it to stop. He wasn't looking for praise. "That's enough," he said gently. "Just remember it." The crowd slowly began to disperse. Conversations buzzed quietly. Some people replayed the moment on their phones. Others simply walked away thinking. Chuck turned back to his daughter. "Let's go," he said. They began walking together side by side. As they moved away, someone in the crowd called out, "Thank you." Chuck paused and looked back. He nodded once. "Do better for each other," he said. "That's all." And then they were gone. But the story didn't end there. Because the footage, those few minutes of calm strength and quiet authority, didn't stay in that place. It traveled across social media, across timelines, across borders. People didn't share it because it was violent. They shared it because it was rare. A man who could have used force, but chose wisdom instead. Before we move into what happened next, I want to hear from you. Do you believe calm strength is more powerful than violence? Type yes or no in the comments below. Because the world's reaction to this moment proved something important. True power doesn't shout. It doesn't threaten. And it doesn't need to prove itself. In the final part, you'll see how this single moment turned into a message that reached millions, and why people are still talking about it long after the crowd walked away. By the next morning, the moment was everywhere. Clips of the encounter flooded social media feeds across different platforms. Titles varied, captions argued, and opinions poured in, but the core of the story stayed the same. A young woman stood her ground. A group of bullies backed down. And a father demonstrated strength without throwing a single punch. People didn't just watch the video, they replayed it. Some focused on the tension at the start, others on the realization when the bullies understood who they were dealing with. But most people talked about the same thing, the calm, the restraint, the way power was handled without aggression. Comments came in from all over the world. This is what real strength looks like. He could have ended it differently, but he chose discipline. This should be taught everywhere. The video sparked conversations far beyond the moment itself. Parents shared it with their children. Teachers discussed it in classrooms. Coaches used it as an example of leadership. What began as an uncomfortable public incident turned into a lesson on character, respect, and accountability. Chuck Norris never tried to capitalize on it. He didn't release a dramatic statement. He didn't go on a media tour. When asked about it later, his response was simple. It wasn't about me. He explained that the real focus should be on how people treat one another, especially when they think no one important is watching. Everyone deserves respect, he said, not because of a name or reputation, but because they're human. That message resonated. The bullies were never named. There was no public shaming, no online witch hunt. That, too, was intentional. The goal wasn't revenge. It was reflection. And perhaps the most powerful part of the story came from Chuck Norris' daughter herself. When someone asked her how she stayed so calm, she answered honestly. I was nervous, she said, but my dad always taught me that confidence isn't loud. It's steady. That line alone spread just as fast as the video. In a world where conflict often turns explosive, this moment stood out because it didn't follow the usual script. There was no shouting match, no dramatic takedown, just presence, clarity, and accountability. And that's why people remembered it. Days later, the story was still circulating, not as a viral spectacle, but as a reminder. A reminder that strength isn't measured by how much harm you can cause, but by how much restraint you can show. As the attention slowly faded, one thing remained clear. Something meaningful had happened. Not because of who Chuck Norris is, but because of what he chose to represent in that moment. Before we end this story, I want to leave you with one final thought. The bullies didn't regret their actions because of fear. They regretted them because they were forced to confront respect. And sometimes, that's the most powerful consequence of all. If you believe bullying is never okay, type respect in the comments. Subscribe for more powerful, inspiring stories that remind us what real strength looks like. Because the world doesn't need more anger. It needs more moments like this.